All right. Hey, everybody. So we're going to start with our next presentation. We're going to see a presentation by Robert LeBlanc called Gloryland. So with that, Robert.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming through. So I released a book in 2013 called Gloryland, which is essentially documenting the last serpent-handling church of West Virginia, and one of the last serpent-handling churches left in America, and especially in the Appalachian Mountains. So I think we're going to kind of just dive into the project, what it's about, the process that I went into it, kind of telling the story, the narrative, and all the fun things that comes with drinking poison and using deadly snakes in church service. So the church is based in West Virginia, very rural part of West Virginia called McDowell County. It is literally in the middle of nowhere. There is no cell phone service, there's little to no resources, and the kind of the way that I was introduced to this world was taking these kind of windy mountain roads up through into the mountains. I love this image because it kind of reminds me of a snake like wrapping up into the forest, and I think it kind of illustrates really well the world that we're in, right? Like when you kind of understand a community and you kind of understand a project, it's really important to dive into like, why am I here? What makes this world so important? Why does this religion, out of all religions, is only really flourishing, or is dying now, but part of the mountains? And I think in this image, this is kind of my first introduction to this world, where I'm stepping into this kind of sense of the unknown. And it really plays a lot to just the landscape of the community as well. These kind of dilapidated power lines, these kind of road that's starting to break in the corner, these kind of guardrails that are bending, and it really kind of represents where are we going, why are we here, and this journey that we're about to take into this church. As I kind of went into the mountains, the landscape is obviously the first thing that really kind of resonates with me, and it's this idea of the history of it. West Virginia is it's been affected a lot by the coal and the gas industry, right? This is kind of a whole reason why, this community is really poor and poverty-stricken. McDowell County is one of the poorest counties in the country, if not it was for a while. And, I had somebody explain it to me that it was like our America's version of Tibet, in a sense. It's a mountain in a region full of resources, but because of all these resources, they're taking advantage of this community. They're essentially extracted, and then the money is pushed somewhere else, far away from the mountains, far away from the town where all this happens. So when you kind of start to approach this world, and you start to kind of understand the environment you're in, a lot of the stuff that I would see is these kind of remnants of old coal industry, right? This photo on the top corner is about a coal loader. So essentially when the trains would come in, they would pull underneath this loader, and then they would jump a bunch of coal into the cars, and that's kind of how they would load up all the freight trains to push through from the mountains down into wherever coal was needed. And in that chain reaction of this industry, you start to really see the presence of poverty, the presence of being forgotten. And a lot of these buildings, you would drive up these windy roads and you would see these kind of dilapidated homes, or what used to be maybe a building for a coal, whatever it would be, maybe a working station or somewhere where someone would look out or work or whatnot. So you would see these kind of past memories of a booming industry, these past memories of a world that was thriving at one point, and now it's been kind of forgotten about and taken advantage of, essentially. And then you're thick in the mountains, these super dense trees, and sometimes you can get on top of these mountains and just kind of look into the forest. And I really thought that was a really good image of this sense of hidden world, right? Something you can kind of see from above, but you don't really understand what's happening until you kind of dive underneath it and you kind of explore this community that's underneath the surface level of this county that we're in. There's more examples of this kind of remnants of an industry, you know, these kind of steel beams that have been forgotten about. This was on an old train bridge right outside the church. And, you know, again, it's just like another region, another section of this community that's been forgotten about and totally dismissed, essentially. So as I kept going into the community, I start to realize, you know, meet the people, understand who am I talking with, where are we at, why is this happening here? And then almost the first thing you really start to notice once you get off a main interstate is this presence of religion. This isn't for sure like a Bible Belt part of the country. And almost instantly once I got off the freeway, it's church, cross. There's like all these symbolisms of how powerful religion plays a role in this community and the presence that it is there. This was like kind of on an end. You'd find these all over the place, but, you know, like a little dead end road with a cross in the back. And then this was actually, you know, kind of climbing through the mountains. This is the pastor of the church is Chris, and this is his brother. And we actually went out on a snake hunt on one of my trips. But I think this really kind of shows the isolation. A lot of like who these people are, why are they here, and they're kind of left on their own accord, essentially. So when I look at these kind of images, it's when you're in a world where you're kind of forgotten about and you're kind of left to your own, you know, resources in a sense. It's pretty common to see these kind of communities circle to God or circle to religion for some answers, and this kind of photo of him in isolation in the forest really illustrates this kind of, they're on their own. They're, you know, this is a world that's been forgotten about, and it's up to their own resources to kind of keep it going and keep this world alive, essentially. You know, same thing, almost every mile I'd see a church. And again, this is kind of more of that imagery of, whoa, we're stepping into a world of religion, we're stepping into this kind of world of faith, and, you know, illustrating this on why it's so important, why, and tying in this idea of why does this church survive here? Why does this religion survive here? Why are these people still kind of holding on to this archaic practice that only to these mountains that it's happening in? And it's because of this kind of devout faith that's inside these mountains, inside these regions. And then eventually we get to the church. And it looks like any other church. They're all almost carbon copies of each other, these kind of little white buildings on the side of the road in these little forgotten towns. And but this is the house of Lord Jesus, and this is where it is the last church that handles poisonous snakes, drinks poison, and handles fire during their church services. And I think it really kind of shows a lot of just the modesty of it and the realness of it. And, you know, this church kind of has this feeling of it barely holding on this side of this riverbed, you know, kind of and you can't see it in the image, but there's like these wooden stilts that are kind of barely holding on, and it really is a good metaphor for why we're here and why they're the last church that's in existence for the most part. So even though, obviously, I was excited about this idea of a serpent-handling church. I've always wanted to see it. I've been working on a book on America for the last 10 years, and a part of this book, I really wanted to talk a lot about this old America, this kind of bit of America that's been forgotten about, or it's kind of on its way out. You know, with technology and kind of how fast everything's moving, this old mystic kind of romance of old America that we're starting to become harder and harder to discover. And for me, it was knowing that these churches survived, and I knew they were pretty much on the verge of extinction at any time now. Probably, I would assume in another decade, most of these, if not all of them, are going to be extinct for the most part. But, you know, what I really didn't realize about this church is it's really a story about a family, and it's a story about succession, and, you know, who's going to pass on this torch. And this is kind of a reason why a lot of these churches don't exist anymore, is because the younger generations aren't keeping it alive. They're not keeping the practice alive. And So, our main characters in this story, which I come to discover the more I spend time there, is there's Snook, which is her nickname, which is Chris's mother. And she is kind of the foundation of this religion that's still existing. She was there during the boom when these churches were just raging in like the 80s and the 90s. And she's kind of the last of that generation that's still alive, that's holding on to this practice. And then you have her son, Chris. And Chris is the pastor of the church at the moment. Now, Chris, his brother passed away about 10 years ago after being bitten by a rattlesnake. And then before that, his father passed away, who started the church, from being bitten by a rattlesnake as well. So he's the third in the family to kind of keep this church alive. And since I've known Chris, he's almost been bitten and died, in the last 7 years that I've been shooting with him. So there's really no, idea how long he's going to keep being the pastor of the church, depending on the pace that everything is going at the moment. So really, when it comes down to is the succession and the ability for this church to kind of continue going lies on Elijah, which is, Chris's nephew, Chris's sister's son. And when we're looking at this kind of lineage, like, this is really the history and maybe the possible future of where this is going to go. And I think it's interesting because Elijah really doesn't. He's part of it because he's been born into it, but he loves music, and he doesn't necessarily want to be a pastor. He doesn't really necessarily want to hold the torch to continue the church going. And I think it's a really interesting way, I think, of showing where this is going, because he always feels that if I have to, or if I'm the one that has to kind of bring it on, I'll do it. But really, what Elijah loves is making his music. So if Chris gets bit, this could be the end of it. Elijah might not continue the church, and this could be the kind of end of this generational run of a church that is really the last one kind of holding it on. And then some of the family history. These are photos that I took from their family archive. And this top one up here, Dewey Chafin is a really famous figure in this world. The rumor is that he's been bitten over like 150 times during church services. And the photos were taken in his father's church. So, this is kind of showing this like lineage of a religion that's been passed through generation after generation. And this is kind of, when you're talking about, and I'll explain a little bit more when we look at some more stuff in the book, but it's when you're working on a project, and especially if it's a project about if something's going to go extinct, I think it's really important to try to visualize the history of it. And it's a kind of a tricky thing to do if you weren't there to like witness the history, right? So relying on archival material and be able to kind of look back into, history, I think is a really good way of kind of tying in these connections of, where did it started, how did we get here, and, what was it like when it was actually booming, and what was it like when these churches were just packed full of people, like parties of like 90 people, and church services for 5 or 6 hours. And a lot of it is, I was able to kind of find some of this stuff in the old family archive. I also worked with the University of Chattanooga with a professor of religion, his name is Ralph Hood, who's like the world leading expert in serpent-handling churches. And he was going around and filming these churches for almost like 40 years. So I was really blessed to have this privilege of diving into his archival footage and kind of giving you this visual of past and present. And it really helps illustrate the depth of a community, a depth of a culture in a sense. And we'll see some more photos as we go on about kind of what it was like. But another example of someone getting bit during a church service. This is Chris's father and one of his members of the church. I love this photo because he's laughing and smiling on it, which is just crazy. He just got bit by a rattlesnake. And these guys, it's like a rite of passage almost in a sense. And seeing him kind of smile, seeing him kind of ecstatic as his hand is just like swelling up like a balloon, I think this really illustrates that, how devout these people are. How much they're just 100% in to this religion and this passion that they have and this movement that they're involved in. And this photo always makes me laugh. That's crazy. And then we kind of step into the church. And this is what I love about this image is it really helps show, again, kind of what we talked about with the region, the poverty, where we're at, the place that we're holding into. And this kind of dilapidated, trash-filled basement is just full of great subject matter, I think, for an image. And, he's got his kind of cardboard box that he lets the snake sleep in and this kind of Walmart aquarium that he buys, but still this old church photo of Jesus floating in the background. But this was the first time that I really got introduced to the snakes. It took me almost 3 months to get permission to go into this church. And it was a lot of conversation. I got chased out of 2 of them in Mississippi. I essentially showed up and they told me to drive back to California where I came from. And I couldn't come in. And it was kind of a weird dilemma because I was like, well, there's only a few churches left to go. If I keep getting kicked out at this pace, I'll never be able to get into a church. So I was able to connect with Chris, and I talked to him for 3 months before he invited me up there. And we got there in the middle of the night. It was like a real deliverance kind of like feeling. He even made a deliverance jokes, which was pretty funny. And I get into this church, and everybody's sitting in the church just waiting, and they essentially interrogate me for about an hour. Because in this community, which is understandable, but they're made a spectacle a lot of, right? Like somebody like Vice or some sort of media company will come in, spend a few hours with them, get the church service, make it look crazy, and be like, these people are nuts, they handle snakes, and that's it. So, as you can imagine, these churches are very guarded, and they're very protected, and they're very wary of outsiders trying to come in and spend time with them. So it took me a while to gain that trust, and eventually, I sat down with the church, and I kind of let them know why I was doing this. I wanted to see this. I thought this was a really rare and exciting thing, and I really only wanted to be there for one church service. That was it. Like I said, I was working on another book, and I was like, if I can get one frame from a church service, this will be fantastic, and then I'll keep going on this project that I'm working on. That night, Chris is like, oh, come down, come see the snakes, come down to the basement, and we were giving us the whole tour of the snakes and everything. And he's like, you can sleep in the church tonight, because we were road tripping, so we were sleeping in our car. And as you can imagine, you just hear rattlesnakes. And I was like, I don't think I want to sleep in the church tonight, Chris. I appreciate the offer, but I don't think this is going to happen. There's about like 30 snakes in the basement. But that was kind of my first introduction to the church and why we're at. And I became really familiar with these snakes. Almost all the snakes that they use in the church are all caught in the mountains there. They're part of that landscape. So, inside, this is kind of an image shot of what they show, and you'll see them a little bit. They have these really special boxes. It's very unique to the culture. It's like these wooden boxes with plexiglass tops, and it's a really cool thing that's really unique to them, but it's also a functionality way of when they go to back in the day, they would go to different church services and they would take their snakes with them. So with the plexiglass top, you can see what snake you have in there, and it was very obvious if the snake wasn't in there or whatnot. So this is actually through one of the boxes, and he caught a bunch of copperheads. So it was just like literally a box just full of copperhead snakes. And then this was the big monster rattlesnake he would have in the basement. This snake bit Chris within a month of me meeting him. So he almost died within a month. I was on my way to go see them, and he called me from the hospital, and he was like, I don't think I'm going to make it, brother. And he was lying on the hospital bed, and dialysis was coming up. It was pretty much a wrap, and all of a sudden his organs started kicking in, and he survived. And this was the snake that almost took him out. And this snake always kind of had this weird energy to it. I've only ever, it's passed away now, earlier this year, but it got so big that if you had the skin that it would shed, it would be taller than I was. It was like almost 7 feet long. And it was like a monster. Like if it bit me in my hands, the fangs would cut go all the way through my hands. It was insane. And they actually had to stop using it because it got so big they didn't have a box to carry it at. But, you know, you kind of start to get used to, you know, for me, there's death in this practice, right? There's death in the process of this religion. And, you know, these are like these snakes are so much the foundation of why they do this and what they're doing and what they have at risk for. So for me, it's, when you're developing the series, and I'm kind of looking at a series of images, like these are kind of our, you know, our main characters, or one of our main characters in this book that we're trying that we're going to experience throughout the whole narrative of the story. So why do they do this? What is the reason why they hold snakes in church? And this is essentially the foundation of why this happens. They're Old King James Church. They don't like to be considered a break off of Pentecostal, but they are. And they consider themselves signs following or holiness churches. And really, in this verse, this is where the signs following aspect comes from, is these are the signs that they believe that they were instructed to perform during church service to illustrate the presence of the Holy Spirit. So in their mind, when they handle snakes, or you know, they drink any deadly poison thing and it won't hurt them, and they lay hands on each other, like these are all almost considered small miracles. And if they perform these signs to the public, it's a way to prove that the Holy Spirit is real, and it's a way to prove that, you know, God is protecting them, and by them following these instructions, they're spreading God's words, essentially. And it's nuts because this whole religion is essentially based on, you know, Mark 17 and 18, and following these signs are the foundation to everything that we're going to look at. And a lot of people think when they see these snakes that they're tempting the devil, or they're tempting evil, or, you know, the snake represents evil, but it's not really quite the case. It's really about, these are signs that they were instructed to follow, and by them following that, they are doing what they believe that God told them to do to show that God is real and they're protecting them. So our main signs that we're looking at is drinking the poison, handling fire, and the rattlesnakes. And I think it was really important when I was developing the book, was to really make these stand out on their own, because there's such a main reason of why we're here. So in the church, they drink shots of strychnine, poison. So what they'll essentially do is they'll mix it up in these mason water bottles, put like about a tablespoon, a little bit less than a tablespoon of poison in there, and if the church is like really popping and people are really excited, they take little Dixie cups and they'll take shots of this poison during church service, which again ties into, you can drink any deadly poisonous thing and it won't harm you. It's really not the case, obviously. Strychnine makes your like body lock up. So, you know, when church is going, everybody's really crazy. Everybody's moving and warmed up, sweating, and the flow's going, but you can see when the people sit down and they sit for maybe 30 minutes, 40 minutes during a church service, they have like a really hard time getting up. And that's your joints locking up from the poison. That's like the side effect of the poison flowing through your body. The other thing they have is these kind of makeshift Molotov cocktail style things where, you know, if church is going really good, the same reason the energy's flowing, they'll hold this fire bottle essentially under their arm or underneath their neck, and you know, they'll dance with it. And again, it's like a way of showing that, you know, the Holy Spirit's there, and the flames can't burn them, and they are being, you know, protected over. And then obviously we have the snakes. And again, this is another good illustration of the box, which is like such a thing of theirs. And these boxes are so cool. Like someone will be tricked out with like engravings and special carvings, and it's really kind of this like folk art style of this church that I found really, really fascinating. But yeah, so that's our main characters pretty much. And again, here's another image of the box. This was at a kind of like a traveling church service, because, you know, we're so poor, this area is so poor, and they don't have a lot of resources. You know, getting a group of people, paying for the gas, driving up in the mountains for an hour to go to a church service sometimes isn't possible for some people who want to come to the church. So if enough people request, for Chris, they'll kind of pack up the church and they'll take it to anywhere for the most part. This was in Virginia, where it's illegal. West Virginia is the only state in the country where serpent handling is not illegal. The rest of them got to keep it kind of underground and private. And so we kind of traveled to this church service, and we actually went to this like little tiny town, and they did an impromptu church service in like a VFW like community center building, which was pretty fun. But this is how they travel with the snakes and how they take them from church to church. Another sign is the praying on each other. I think that is something that you see a lot in these churches, and especially they call it, when they really feel the Holy Spirit in the church, they call it an anointing. And when there's a heavy anointing, they will usually lay a lot of hands on people who are having a hard time, and then they will actually pray over this special church cloth, and then they'll cut it in little pieces, and they'll give everybody these little pieces of cloth, and they're supposed to be kind of these like tokens of protection. They tell me these old stories about like this guy flipped his truck and rolled it 3 times, and he came out unscathed because he had one of those pieces of cloths like pinned underneath his hat when the car accident happened. So these are kind of these moments in the service that I really enjoyed, because it was very much kind of this thing that you can't really visualize, right? It's just this energy that they're really trying to harness and really trying to bring that prayer and that worship into these different people. And the laying of the hands is one of those signs. And then the 2 images on the right are from those archival videos that I was explaining about earlier that I was able to look into. So you have, from 97, this one I think was, the top one is even from earlier, like maybe like 87, 86. So this is a good like grouping of like when the church was thriving, when things were going, and then this kind of more insular, small community of like 13 people that are really trying to hold it on and keep this world alive. And I love it. It's so fun. There's a few churches. This one that I went to, they don't really do it, but they call Fallen in the Saint, was when people pass out. And a few Pentecostal churches will do that. They'll just lay hands and people pass out during church services. And it's kind of this illustration of prayer and how important it is to them. So the first thing you see when a church service happens is they have this really like interesting formula that I really enjoyed. And the first thing what really happened was all the women would kind of kneel down and start weeping and praying really loudly. So my first introduction to the church and just the experience is a lot of crying and this kind of like weeping really heavily into the church pews. And this was almost like, I've been to hundreds of church services by now. I've spent 7 years with them. And you can always tell when a church service is going to kind of pop off, because this is the first thing that kind of starts happening. And it was pretty shocking, when I first saw it. Like, when you see it, you wouldn't expect that your first kind of experiences crying and weeping and kind of screaming into these pews. But yeah, this was kind of this. And then this was the image that I ended up taking on my very first trip, and I ended up just seeing it over and over and over and over again. But yeah, again, this kind of ties in with the praying and kind of calling on the Holy Spirit. The music is a really big part of the service. The music it's very unique. I've never seen anything like it. They kind of have developed their own kind of worship, which it's really unfortunate, but no one's really ever recorded them over the 100 years of these church services being around. And it's this weird mix of gospel and blues and kind of almost like mountain rock. And these churches, they just crank them. It's like ear bleeding loud, and they just rock as hard as they can. And that was also like a really unique experience that I loved about figuring this out and diving into this community, because I would have never thought that they would have their own style of music, their own style of worship that they were doing. And Elijah playing, I always looked at Elijah as like the puppet master a little bit. People would kind of hype themselves up, but like really when Elijah started kind of picking away and getting people going, you can see him almost kind of controlling the crowd and getting people hyped up. And certain moments where a pastor would freak out and start screaming, he would kind of pluck in with his guitar, and like people would get jumped and get hyped up. So I always looked at this image as like kind of, Elijah really is, even though, even if he does decide to keep the church going or not, he was really the puppet master of these church services, and it was something really interesting to experience. And then you got the snakes. And it's exciting. It's crazy. Like these things could kill you at any moment, and not only doing one, you're going to handle two at the same time, which is just insane. But this is kind of how this excitement of the church service goes. He would dance, and these snakes would kind of be out everywhere, and and it's almost like they're kind of looking over the church service, kind of watching over everybody as they dance around and scream around. And these are one of those moments that was pretty exciting. I'm shooting on a 28, so I'm essentially like he can just drop a snake on me at any time, which almost happened a couple times. He almost hit me with the snake down, like whacked me around the head with it. But I think what's really important about this frame, obviously, the snakes it's exciting, but really we have the photo of his brother in the background, and that's Randy, who got bit by a snake and died. So I think when you look at an image that's kind of telling a story or a narrative in a sense, we have this kind of weird moment of lineage, but Randy's kind of mimicking, doing the same thing Chris is doing right now, but we know that Randy died from this. So when I see this image, it reminds me a lot about the death that's in this practice and the risks that they are taking by, essentially doing this. I always was blown away that even though, I don't believe in this and a lot of people don't, obviously it's a very small community, but I don't think I've ever met anybody, a group of people who are so dedicated and so devout to what they're doing that they're willing to risk their lives twice a week to do this. And I think there is some credit to be said there. You know what I mean? I think that's it's a lot of, it could be faith in whatever you have in your life, but I think that kind of dedication is something really powerful. And I see that a lot in this image because I see what there is that can be lost, right? What can be, what there is to risk from that. And seeing Randy in the background is a perfect sign of that happen, and that could happen to anybody at any time whenever those snakes are brought out. Was another example of handling snakes. Chris would have some homies from like Kentucky that would come up. These churches have these things called homecomings, which are essentially their like big church service they have every year, and other members from other churches go to these homecomings. So this was during their homecoming, so he had some friends from Kentucky come in. And this guy was just crazy. He would just grab anything at any time, and it was completely fearless, which is pretty wild. But I love this image because it's just, you have one snake looking at the crowd, you have this other one just kind of staring him down, and he is so in the moment that his eyes are closed, and doesn't even care if this snake is considering to bite him or not. And that's always, when I look at this photo, it kind of just blows me away again of that just unwavering faith in something. It's really, really incredible. And this is Chris's mother with holding the fire bottle underneath her neck. This was kind of always her thing. I didn't really ever see her handle a snake too often. Maybe just once I've ever seen it happen, but the fire bottle was her thing. And she would always kind of kick off the church service by grabbing this fire bottle and holding it underneath her neck. And yeah, I love this image, and it's so cool because they have their own style of clothing. I'm sure you've already noticed by now. They believe that you should always be in a dress. The dress should go always to the floor. They always have their head wrap. Obviously it's a very archaic kind of way of thinking about this, but this image kind of really ties that in. And then again, Chris holding another rattlesnake right over my head. And even just the way he's just like barely holding it up. You know what I mean? It's just that there's this like flow that's going in these church services that are quite powerful. And when I experienced my first one, it was insane. You know, like I didn't really know what to expect, and the energy is like so electric, and it's so intense that I got hooked on it. Right? I came in. My idea was to get one photo, and I got sucked in for 7 years because I was like, this is such an incredible thing. I've never seen this before, and I want to keep on witnessing this again because it's quite a subculture that is so unique and so rare. Which is fun. And then one of the most exciting parts, one of the church services, is when everything was booming and rocking. Chris was in the moment. He just like slapped this snake on a Bible and just kept preaching. And he preached for like 30, 40 minutes. As this whole time, this snake is just like looking out on everybody, just hanging out on the Bible. And this was a really cool moment. Out of all the services that I've been to, I've never seen anything like it. And, you know, it really kind of tells where we're at, why we're here, what's the whole reasoning of exploring this community. And it was pretty exciting. It was pretty wild. And I was able just to walk around the pulpit, and this thing would turn its head and just watch me the whole time. And it was a really fun moment. Anyway, on the side, you get to see the mason bottle with the poison, and those little Dixie cups. That's kind of where they take the shots of the poison at. But it was, that was a very kind of unique moment after witnessing so many services. And then here's a little bit more of the archive. That's Dewey Chafin, the one that I was talking about earlier. I mean, literally he's holding like 15 snakes at one time. It's so crazy. You know, more examples of the fire being used. You know, sometimes they would put 2 bottles down and put their feet over it, or you know, holding multiple snakes. The praying up top is someone who got bit. So I think it was really great to be able to dig through 40 years of where these churches came from and when they were booming, and being able to tie in ultimately this narrative of succession and why these churches exist, and if they're going to go extinct, and being able to have these old videos that I could kind of go through and reinterpret. I feel like it really helps solidify this like narrative of history and lineage and succession a lot. But there were wild times. They would have they'd be packed door to door of people, and it was a party. Church service going for hours. Another example of pouring out the snakes during a church service. It was, and they would do that. They'd just get excited, and they would just dump these things out on the floor, and people would grab them and raise them and hold them up. They were never abusive to the snakes. I think a lot of people think that, you know, they keep them cold so they're stiff, or they defang them. I mean, they're kept in captivity, so they're in a cage for the most part. But I never really saw much of them like animal abuse besides the obvious fact of just catching them and keeping them. But yeah, they would just kind of pour these snakes out and get church just raging. And I think another really good image that ties in this story of succession is all three of our main characters again, right? We have the snake, we have, you know, Snook, Chris, and Elijah. And when I think of an image that really kind of portrays this whole story of why we're here and what we're trying to say, like, this is the kind of image that I think, if I had to pick one image from everything, this is the one, right? Because we get a little bit of everything in there. And I think seeing this kind of generational run, I mean, even in the back, we have, you know, Randy's a kind of plaque in the back, and you know, this sign that's the white one that's on the left, that was all hand done by Randy. And a thing that I noticed a lot during the church service was Chris could never really, Randy was like the perfect pastor. And he was the pastor that everybody loved. He was the pastor that, you know, really bound the congregation together. So when they lost him, Chris filled this void, but Chris used to be a pretty wild guy. He was a pretty heavy drug addict. He preaches a lot about his like really bad crack binges and alcoholism, and they were a very wild family. And I think Chris kind of had to give that all up, right? Chris had to kind of put that aside and pick up the church and keep that going. And even till this day, he's never really filled that void of what Randy had. Randy was kind of their guy. So no matter whether I was having a dinner with them, or it was his anniversary of his death, or it was a church service, like the ghost of Randy was always around. Everybody was always talking about I remember when Randy was here, or when Randy did this service, or Chris isn't Randy, or Chris being like, I wish I could be like my brother Randy. I think this image really kind of has his spirit, his ghost that's kind of floating in these inanimate objects that are on the wall, which I think is really important. But yeah, I think, especially when I was deciding how do I tell this story, or where is this narrative I have to be, this to me is the one that really solidifies that and kind of brings it together if I had to put everything in one image. Yeah. And the church services are crazy. They're really energetic. They're really dancing and screaming, and Chris will jump up and down on things. So I really wanted to kind of bring in these images of more these close-up textural details of some of these other things that you don't really think of at the church outside the snakes, right? And just Chris soaking in sweat, or Snook praying and her head barely sticking out of her always all black clothes. I think these are these are these little subtle details that I love to tie into the story that really kind of tell a little bit more and give you as a viewer a little bit more of a closer feeling of that. And I think that's really, I specialize I mostly do long form stories. There's usually, most of my projects at least last for 4 years. And I think it's those subtle things that you notice all the time, but they might not be exciting. I think these are those little nuggets of precious moments that you can kind of tie in and really bring in experience and really give viewers an understanding of a little bit more of an intimate feeling of being in that community or being in that space with folks like this. And yeah, these are a couple images I really felt like that. And then we have the ultimate boogeyman, which is being bitten. And luckily I never saw anybody bitten. I think I got so close with this family that I was having dinner with them. I was talking to them all the time. We really took me in as a family member. And the boogeyman was always, when is someone going to get bit, right? That's always kind of the scary thing to think about. And every time I saw a snake come out, your stomach kind of turns, because you kind of think, is this the moment? Is this the moment that someone's going to die tonight? Is this the moment that it changes everything that I know, or I lose somebody that I became really close to by working on this project? And luckily, I never saw that, which was amazing. And so, digging through the family archive, I was able to see this image of one of his dad's members getting bit. And when they get bit, it's a really crazy experience, because they don't, and the reason why they die is because they don't go to the hospital. They really believe that you shouldn't go and seek medical attention. That's wavering in your faith. That's not being 10 toes down on what you believe. And so what they'll usually do is they'll take somebody to someone's house, and they'll have another church service. And then that person will lay in a bed or lay on a couch, and they'll just have a full rager at the church service. And I've even seen videos of them handling snakes over the person who got bit earlier that day, it's pretty crazy. I'm glad Chris freaked out and did go to the hospital, or this, I wouldn't even have a project to look at, and Chris wouldn't be alive, because he for sure was going to die. So it's not only that there's death in it, but it's immense suffering. We're talking anywhere between 7 to 12 hours of just agonizing pain, and eventually, your insides kind of liquefy from the venom and the poison, and it's a really horrible and painful way to go. So, you kind of always think, oh, this is so crazy, or people will be like, these guys are nuts, and whatever. But again, this is kind of that visualization of the sacrifice and that faith that these people have, and they're so passionate in what they do that they're willing to like face death on a regular basis, and they know what the risks are, right? They understand loss, they understand how traumatic it can be to their families and their communities, but their dedication to it is still rigid, that they still continue to do that. And this is a good example of just like what happens when you get bit. And this man, he eventually lived. And you don't always die. It's actually, you're more likely to live than you aren't. It really depends on what kind of snake it is, how much poison they want to pump into you, where they bite you, like all these kind of variables. But yeah, I felt like this was a really good illustration of that risk of death that happens, and it happens very often within this community. And then this is the bite that almost killed Chris. And they essentially just had to fillet his arm out, and he sent me photos of him in the hospital with his like arm wide open, which is crazy because I don't know why you're taking cell phone photos at the hospital as you're being chopped up. It's pretty nuts. But this was this scar that always stuck with him. And the ironic thing about it is that he always lived with regret, even though he knew that he was going to die. It was a for sure fact it was going to happen if he didn't go to the hospital. And even at the hospital, they're like, you're going to die. But he felt so bad that he wavered in his faith that he was ashamed that he didn't make that sacrifice, which is something that I always found incredibly fascinating, especially when you knew what the outcome would be. And I think it's a reason, I don't know if it was shame or just being scared of why that big snake really didn't get brought off anymore, but this scar was kind of a reminder of his failed faith, which I really found quite fascinating and very ironic, because that's the reminder that like the death that he has to face every time he does what he does. So this is on his like front porch of his house in the mountains, and he'll spend hours a day reading his Bible. And I really wanted to see this kind of big scar healed up after such a traumatic moment. So when I decided to design the book, it was really kind of, for me, it was how do I tie this in? How do I bring this world into a viewer's experience? And all these things that I learned while being in this community, and all these elements that are really important to this world, I need to try to articulate that in the design, right? So I was really fortunate enough to be introduced to a Bible print house. And so we actually made this book 100% Bible replica. The paper, the material, the cover, everything is done with materials that they use for manufacturing Bibles, which I thought was a really great experience, because as you flip through the book, this feeling of Bible paper and just, it's almost like you're very familiar with the object, but when you open up the object, it's a whole separate world that you never would expect inside the Bible. And that was kind of a design choice that I decided to go with. I had all these different variations that I made, but the Bible really seemed like it tied in for obvious reasons, but just the tactile experience of flipping through and experiencing the series of stuff. And even down to like the all black, right? The idea of this being a solid black brick is it's supposed to represent coal. And coal industry plays such a huge role because of the poverty and of the isolation of these communities. That's why these religions kind of thrive, because when you're surrounded by suffering all the time, and you're surrounded by crazy health sickness from the gas industry, from fracking the water, or the coal, or the opioid epidemic that really sprung out in this region, in Dow County. You're surrounded by so much negativity and so much suffering that it makes sense why a community will hold on to something so extreme, right? Because it kind of counteracts this. It makes you justify why everybody is forgotten about you and why you're kind of like at a huge disadvantage, right? So for me, it was making this solid black really represented coal. It really represented wrapping our world and why we're here and why this all started. And even some of the theories is that the very first serpent-handling church happened at a coal mine. It was like kind of a traveling tent tent churches would come and they'd show up at a coal mine and they would have an impromptu service, and one of those services, one of somebody raised a snake. And that's kind of the wise tales, that this religion happened it started in a coal mine. And then when you open up the book, you have these really bright white pages. And I think that kind of really represents this fight of good and evil, this idea of having hope in a situation where you don't have a lot of hope, right? And I think for them, everything is black and white, right? The only reason they pick up these snakes is because the Bible told them so. That's it. Like there's really no gray area for them. So for me, is having this kind of really white visceral experience when you open up from a black exterior kind of helps you kind of bring into, and this is some of the design that I really wanted to tie in, and there's always these kind of wordings that are good and evil, and they used to say like victory is a really common word. I had victory over the serpent. So I really wanted to bring in these kind of things that were very familiar with me and were very common in this community. So as you flip through the book, you have a good understanding of all these elements and on all this stuff. And I got to transcribe, luckily with the university, I got to transcribe a bunch of old interviews of people who passed away and sermons. So within the sermons, or within the book, there's all these kind of sermons and interviews and stuff of people that just are no longer around anymore. So yeah, and that was kind of the idea. And the purple ribbon is supposed to represent, you see this a lot with Jesus, of royalty, and this idea of like color purple. So it's just like this little bit of hint of, the Christianity element to the church and everything like that. So yeah, so at the end of the day, I got a new family. And this is all that's left of the West Virginia Serpent-Handling Church, these group of people. They're kind of the last to survive. And I think it's a really beautiful gift for us as photographers to be able to interject ourselves in people's lives and tell their stories. It's a huge responsibility. They're trusting you to be there with them, whether you do agree with them or you don't. Like you're given a beautiful gift to be intimate in someone's life. And it's not often you'd be like, hey, I want to tell your story and I'm going to be around for 7 years. It's a really cool privilege. And I think, even though I'm not a religious person, I've learned a lot about myself. I've learned a lot about faith. I've learned a lot about community. I've learned a lot about our region that's been taken advantage of. And I think, these kind of moments are so beautiful for a photographer. And I think it's something that you shouldn't, never take obviously never take advantage of it, but never, second guess what a beautiful gift you're given to be able to experience other people in their lives and tell their stories, even if it's crazy as it might sound. So yeah, that's it. Thank you guys for listening. Appreciate it.